A short video on printing in Python, 2 new ways of printing along with formatted printing. Let's go. This should not be too bad. What I have here is a program that I've written. In fact, I've written a much longer one that we're going to go through and take components of and bring into our editor here. And let me zoom way in so we can go through these comments. Strings in Python. What is a string? A string is simply a sequence of 0 or more characters where all of those characters are enclosed in either a pair of double quotation marks or a pair of single quotation marks. So here are 4 examples. Name equals Grace Hopper, message equals good evening, letter equals A, and notice these first 3 are all enclosed in a pair of double quotation marks. Here I even have letter equals A again, this time enclosed in a pair of single quotation marks. Python makes no distinction between double quotation marks and single quotation marks, whereas many other languages, they do make that distinction. Other languages, a string with more than one character, such as, once again, let's say first name equals Obama. That string has more than one character, therefore other languages would say it has to be enclosed in a pair of double quotations. And a single character, let's just call it some character, other languages say a single character can be enclosed in just a pair of single quotations. And those actually under the hood are treated differently. Other languages, this is just, I don't want to confuse the issue, but it's a different data type called char. It's a primitive data type, has a small memory footprint. It's used for efficiency, whereas this is a string with more than one character. It could have 0 characters. Python makes no such distinction. Python, you have a string can be enclosed in a pair of double quotation marks, or it can be enclosed in a pair of single quotation marks. Also, strings not only have to include letters. They can include punctuation, they can include other keyboard characters, they can include digits. So here we have a string called year, a variable year, with a string, and what is enclosed in that string? 4 numbers, 1920. So here, although we can see that this string year, we can see it contains those 4 digits, right? It has 4 numbers. We see it clearly with our eyes. But internally, it is still stored as a string. And the consequence of which is that we cannot perform mathematical operations on it. So if you were to have x equals 5, and then you want to print x plus 1, you could easily print x plus 1 and you will get 6. Let me run this code. We're going to get 6 exactly as we expected. Whereas if I put this 5 inside a pair of double quotation marks and then I want to print x plus 1, 5 is no longer, or x is no longer a number. X is a string, and we cannot add 1 to a string, which is why Python starts shouting at us, cops an attitude, and starts shouting in red. That's to be expected. So we want to differentiate between a value that is an integer, a number, 146, being saved into the variable x, versus the string 146 being saved into the variable x. Those are 2 different things. So what is concatenation? This is a new word for us. Concatenation in Python is a means of gluing multiple strings or multiple things together. And in Python, it's strictly going to be with strings. So this plus sign, whenever we see it, of course, we traditionally think addition. But that's only true if both operands are numbers. As a reminder, what is an operand? If I say 2 plus 3, this is the operator. It is an addition operator. And then the left and the right of that operator, we find a 2 and a 3. These are called the operands. The 2 is an operand. The 3 is an operand. So This plus sign is only going to be used for addition if both operands are numbers. But what if one of those operands is not a number? Or what if both of those operands is not a number? Clearly, as we just saw, you cannot add a number to a string in Python. That addition operator no longer performs as we would expect, and we get an error. So instead of being addition, when one of the operands is not a number but instead is a string, we now have what is called concatenation. We still use that same plus sign, but it no longer means addition. It now stands for concatenation. What is concatenation? It's when we want to glue two operands together, if you will. So here we say first name equals Bob, last name equals Smith, super creative, and I print first name plus last name. We're not going to add Bob plus Smith together mathematically. That won't work. Instead, Python sees this plus sign and it says, is that going to be addition? Well, it's going to look to the left and right, and it's going to see we have strings on the left and the right. So instead of performing addition, Python is going to perform concatenation. And we see that what gets printed is Bob glued to the word Smith, to the string Smith. I could also concatenate some other space in here. Now we have three things that are being concatenated. First name, we concatenate that string to this string of spaces, which we then concatenate to the string last name. And now we have Bob with many spaces between, and then Smith. Of course, maybe you only want one space between the first and the last name, so we can concatenate that one space. Right? So this is just other text here. It's just another string. Bob, A-S-D-F, Smith. So let's just concatenate a single space between Bob and Smith, the first and the last name, and here we go. So once again, this num1, if I say equals 3, this is not viewed as a number in Python. Num2 equals 8, this is not viewed as a number. Instead, Python is viewing this as a string of text. In this case, it's a string with only one character inside that pair of double quotation marks, and this single character happens to be a digit. No problem. But we cannot perform mathematical operations on this variable num2 because it's not a number. And so here, what happens when we try to print num1 plus num2? I say, what happens when we try to add them? Well, they won't be added. Instead, they will be concatenated. When you look at the output that's already present, I can run it again. We get 38, and let me just put in here a string, num1 plus num2 is, and then I concatenate that just so you can see, num1 plus num2 is, it's 38, it's 38. We're not adding a 3 and an 8 to get 11, they're being concatenated, they're being glued together. That's what the plus sign does when one of the operands or one or more of the operands is a string. All right, what next? We want to see how we can print out strings and variables and what we've seen already, and then learn a new way. Let me come way down here and I'll paste. So printing output with strings and with variables. This is what we've seen thus far, although this step is going to be new I want to cover now. What we've seen thus far, if I have this variable a, and I just want to print the value for a is, I want to print this. The value for a is 4, period. I want to print exactly like that. All we've seen thus far is this means of printing using commas to separate the various things. Here I said that we have 3 things. We have this string, we have the variable a, and then we have this other thing, this period, this third string, or this second string that needs to get printed. So when I run this code, and let me just put an empty print statement above for the purpose of making it clear in the output. For clarity, if I just ran that, I'll get this right here. And I just want to put in, if I erase the print statement, I'll get everything back to back, right? And so I want to just have a little bit more clarity. So I want to put a print statement here and a print statement here, which will just put a blank line in the output. So here's what we're looking at. The value for A is, and notice we have this space here between the 4 and the period. We don't want that. And there's an extra space here. We don't want that. And the reason why is because when you use these commas, this comma method of printing, Python automatically puts a space between everything. As an example, let's put a print statement above and let's type this. A, comma, B, comma, C, comma. And again, these spaces here, since they're just separating strings, it's just a visual space. I can get rid of them just so you can see that doesn't change the output. But look at what happens. We get A space B space C because these commas, by putting them there, Python automatically inserts some space into the output, which maybe you don't want that. That's a problem, right? So on this example, the value for A is 4. We want that output to look exactly like that. But instead, we're getting an extra space here and a space here. You might think, no problem, I can delete that space, but still, we get a space here. So when you use this comma method of printing output, which we're not going to be using much longer after this video, but if you want to tell Python, hey, don't put these spaces, those spaces are trash, you do this. You say sep equals, and you put a pair of double quotation marks. And look what happens. Now that space is gone, but also the space between this string right here and the variable A, which is the value is 4, that space is gone. So Python says, I'm not going to automatically include any extra spaces. Any that you want to include, you have to do on your own. No problem. We can put a space right there. I run it again, but now I, as the developer, have full control, which is fantastic. Using this extra parameter, these are called parameters. Now I'm telling you the correct word. It's not 3 things. We have now 3 parameters plus a 4th parameter that is specifying don't put any separators between any of these other things, these other parameters. If I had put here, let's just say I want to put what? 3 hyphens. 1, 2, 3. That's saying separate all of these 3 things, these 3 parameters, separate each one with 3 hyphens. And now look at the output. The value for A is space. That's this entire first string. Then we have 3 hyphens. That is separating that first string from the number 4. And then between the 4 and the period, we have, once again, 3 more hyphens. I could have made this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 letter A's, and I run it. Sep simply separates that output. Each of the things in the output, it separates with whatever is in sep. So if you want to put nothing inside sep, it's going to say, well, let's separate all of those 3 things with nothing, which removes those spaces. And then we manually added this space back inside the string. Cool. We've covered that clearly, how we can print using this comma method. There's also a method of printing where we don't use commas, but instead we use concatenation. So here's the overall idea, where when I want to print the value for A is 4, consider this print statement. The value for A is, and then I concatenate the variable A, which contains 4, and then I concatenate this period afterwards. So this no longer has commas, but instead we're using concatenation to glue together those 3 parameters, those 3 things, if we will. Unfortunately, at the moment, this code would give you an error as is. If I delete that comment and I run the code, it's going to give us an error. And the reason why is that Python only allows you to concatenate strings. And so here inside this line of code, we have a string being concatenated with what? With a number, with an integer 4. Then that also gets concatenated with another string. So Python does not allow you to concatenate a string with numbers with an integer. So what can we do? The solution is simple. Instead, we convert that number to a string using the string function. And here is that print statement. So we now have three things being concatenated together. We have this first string. We then have this number 4 that we are converting to a string using the string function, which is new for us. Quite simply, let me back all the way out of here. Bear with me. I'm going to pause the video and I'm going to pull up the garbage program. So what I opened here is the garbage program just to show this. If I say x equals 7, and then I say y equals str of x, let's print x and let's print y and get our output. That's not what, oh, okay. Let's do this. I was at first thinking, wait, why is it not showing a string? Because it's not going to print. That was a great moment. That was big brain right there. At first I was confused and I realized that was big brain because I wasn't thinking about the output and what's actually going to be printed here. Let's try that again. What if I did this? X plus 2, which will give us 9, and then y plus 2. What's going to happen? Well, it's going to print 9 for the x plus 2, but this y plus 2, it's not going to work. We're getting an error because it's trying to concatenate the string 7 with 2. So the point is simply this string function, and we know it's a function because it has parentheses. This string function, it simply is expecting a number inside, and it's going to basically encapsulate or enclose that number within a pair of quotation marks. It's converting it to a string. So back to here, we had this line of code, right? And when we run this, we get an error because we cannot concatenate a string with a number. So what do? When you want to use concatenation, whether it be in printing or otherwise? We'll see later examples of when we'll use concatenation not in printing. But anytime we want to use concatenation in Python, knowing it has to all be strings being glued or concatenated together, any numbers, we need to use the string function to convert that number to a string. Quite simply, as we've seen here on line 70, and now when I run it, we get the value for a is 4, and which was from this print statement above. And here we get the same exact thing using concatenated printing. So we've used this method with commas, and we've used this method with concatenation. What comes next? One more example. So here's just summarizing that we've seen this. Two ways of printing, the comma way and the concatenated way. So another example. Let me just copy all of this and paste it. And when I paste, let me scroll over, let me close this assistant. And here's what we have, another example. Imagine we have these 5 values and we want to print this exact line of text. We want a single print statement that will print A is 3, getting this value from the variable A, comma, space, B is 8, comma, C is 5, comma, D is 7, comma, and E is 2. We want to print that exact statement. Now for clarity, we don't just want to make that print statement that you see right here, right? This would be horrible. We don't want to just print that. Why? Because this is called hard coding. This is saying, oh, you want to print these values? Sure, I got your back, no problem. A is 3, B is 8. We're like, yeah, this is big brain. C is 5, D is 7, E is 2. And we're directly printing the values from those variables in a print statement. That's a fail. Why is that a fail? Because what if the user entered these values, for example, or if they came about via calculations? We don't know what's inside those variables. If we ask the user, enter a number for A, for B, C, D, E, we don't know what they put inside A, B, C, D, E, so I can't manually come here and type, well, they put an 8, but how do you know they put an 8, right? So how can we do this when we don't know? Clearly, we can't hard code it, right? Because we don't know what is inside, what is saved inside those variables. Instead, we need to use those variables when printing. So one more time, we want to write a single print statement that produces this output. How do we do that? It's so nasty. I don't even want to type it again. I was tempted to, but here is how we would do that using the comma method. If you want to get this exact statement to print, you'd have to type A is space, and notice we're going to use SEP because we want control as the programmer. We don't want Python to include spaces in various places we may not be expecting them. So we're telling it, don't put extra spaces, we'll space it ourselves. So I said A is, and we put a space here, comma, now we print A, comma, for the next thing, now we put the string which says which says comma space B space is space, comma. Oh, it's so nasty. I'm going to stop reading it. That's this method of printing this string. So we see how we have all of these things that need to get printed. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 things, and all separated with nothing. But it's just a disaster. It's hard to type that out. You're going to end up missing a comma, putting extra commas. It's confusing, and it's quite convoluted. Here's that same print statement, or we're accomplishing that same goal, but now we're using concatenated printing. A is, and we concatenate to that, and we convert here A to a string. And now we can concatenate this string, comma, B is, and we concatenate to that the string value of B. To that we concatenate comma, space, C is, space, and we concatenate to that the string value of C, and so on. You know, here this one's a little bit longer because you're having to use a string function, but I may argue this one's easier to type because all of these commas, it's a disaster, and mistakes are bound to happen. But these are the two ways we know how to type this string thus far. What comes next is the following, because absolutely, if you may have seen that, I typed here, that is nasty. Absolutely. These two lines of output, those two print statements, they are hideous. How do we do better? Because we absolutely can do better. We use what is called formatted printing in Python. And most languages have this means of formatted printing. So simply reflect on the following print statement. Just reflect on that statement, and then we're going to break it down into detail. Reflect on what's perhaps happening, and let me copy paste our objective, the goal, right? The goal is we want to print this statement using the values that are saved in those 5 variables that we made above. So what do we have here? We have A is, and we have these curly brackets, comma, B is, curly brackets, comma, C is, curly brackets. And all of this is inside one string, right? How do you know? You look for the starting quotation mark, and then you just look across and you find the ending quotation mark. So all of that is within one string of text. So what do these curly brackets mean? And we notice after the string of text, once it ends, right, here's the whole string, once that string of text ends, when it says, and E is, and we have another pair of curly brackets, what do we see afterwards? We see dot format, we have another pair of parentheses. That should tell you, oh, this is a function. We're using some format function. So what's really going on? What's happening is these curly brackets, I call them placeholders. What we're really telling Python, the interpreter, is, well, first of all, with this dot format, we're telling it we're going to do formatted printing. And what these placeholders are doing is they're telling the interpreter, hey, I want to print something here, but it's not just going to be some text. Like I'm not going to just manually type in 3. Instead, you're telling the Python interpreter that something goes right here. It's not to be seen just when we look right there, but something special goes there. Comma, space, B is, space. Something else special goes right here. And how many total special things do we see, or how many pairs of these curly braces do we see? 5 of them. And when the string finishes, what do we find? Dot format. And Python's like, oh, I get it now. You had these 5 special things that you want to print. And now I have dot format. We're calling the format function. And check it out. You may have already guessed we have 5 things, 5 parameters being specified within this format function. What ultimately happens is the value of A is going to be taken, which happens to be 3. If we go all the way back up, let me get those values from the variables that are saved in the variables. I'll just copy them again and bring them back down. So here, what happens on this statement is as follows. Each of these placeholders tells the Python interpreter that we need to put the value from a variable right here, or from something else that's included in the format function. But on this example, we need to put the value from a variable right here. Same thing here, another value from a variable. Same thing here, and then same thing right here. Well, those 5 things are found right here, A, B, C, D, and E. So what's really going to happen is we're going to get the value from A, which is a 3, and it's going to be inserted right here within that placeholder. The value from B gets inserted here, that this becomes 8. The value from C gets inserted right here. The value from D gets inserted right here in this 4th placeholder. And finally, in the 5th placeholder, we get the value from the variable E. So when I run this now, notice we get, and let's see, let me put a print statement. Here is the formatted printing. And let me put another empty print statement above that, and we get this. Because these are the 3 that we printed above, right? We printed these 2, and we printed this right here. So this 4th one, here is the formatted printing. Notice we got the exact same output. And it's weird at first, right? If we've never seen formatted printing, the idea of using placeholders, but that's a lot cleaner. And let me even show you how you would have even typed this. What I would do, if you tell me that we need to print this statement, but instead of hard coding these numbers 3, 8, 5, 7, right? Instead of printing them directly into the print statement, instead of doing this, you tell me we need to use the values from the variables, no problem. First thing I'm going to say dot format. And so now we have a new pair of parentheses, right? So dot format. And notice we have a brand new pair of parentheses that I've included right there. That's the format function. How many things do I need to ultimately print? Well, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, representing the values that are stored inside those 5 variables, A, B, C, D, and E. So I just type them in there. And then I simply come to each one of those values and I replace it with a pair of curly brackets. So check this out. That's how easy this is to do with formatted printing. Run it, hopefully no errors, great. Let's do another example. Here's another one. Let's copy this. We want to print this right here. Rachel Williams, ID 5555555, is a first-year student. We want to print that sentence, that line of text, that string of text, but we don't want to hard code the values. We want to grab those values from these variables above. I'm going to call this ID number. So we want to grab, again, the values that need to get printed inside this sentence. We want to grab them from the variables above. So here's the result using formatted printing. But I want to show you how you come up with that result, because you might be thinking, oh, the spacing's confusing. How do I do that? Well, check out how easy this is. So let's start by copying that line of output that we want to get. Let's print it directly, as if we were hard coding that into the output. So I've manually printed Rachel Williams that ID for Rachel Williams, and I manually printed first. So now, what do I do to make this formatted printing? Super simple. I'll leave this print statement right there, just so we can compare. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to type dot format. I'm going to make a new pair of parentheses because I'm going to call the format function. And now I need to ask myself, how many things am I ultimately going to be printing? How many variables are contained, or how many values are contained in this string of output that are really supposed to be coming from variables? Well, I have the first name, Rachel, the last name, Williams. I have the ID number, and then I have this first, which represents the year that the student is in college. So now I need to type within this format command, within this format function, within the parentheses, I need to specify those 4 variables in the exact order that I want them to appear within this output. So the first thing is a first name. So it's actually called name underscore first. The next thing to appear is Williams. So that is name underscore last. The next thing to appear is ID number. So I'll just copy that, ID underscore number. And the final thing to appear is this right here, which is the year of the student in college. So I'll type year. So that's the first step. The second step is to simply go replace each of those values that I hard-coded to replace them with a pair of curly brackets. That gets replaced. Williams gets replaced with a pair of curly brackets. ID gets replaced with a pair of curly brackets. First gets replaced with a pair of curly brackets. So now we have the exact same thing that I showed you, and that's how we come up with this. So once again, how does the Python interpreter, how does it process this? It sees this print statement, it sees the dot format, and then it realizes, okay, inside this dot format, I have 4 variables that are being referenced. And the values from those 4 variables are going to be inserted into the respective 4 pairs of curly brackets that I call or refer to as placeholders. Here's the first placeholder. That's going to get the first parameter that's inside this format function. Remember, these are called parameters. We have 4 parameters here inside the format function. This first parameter, which is called name first, it comes to the first placeholder. The second parameter, name last, it comes to the second placeholder. The third parameter, ID number, comes to the third placeholder. And finally, the fourth parameter, year, comes to the fourth placeholder. All right, that's a lot of information, but we have not even talked about formatted printing. So let me copy the next thing. And we are almost done. Formatted printing. So the purpose of this was to talk about formatted printing. This is called formatted printing, but until now, I have not formatted any of the output. None of the output has been formatted uniquely with certain alignment or spacing or printed over so many spaces or characters. I have not done any formatting, but Python allows you to do formatting. Consider the following table of data, and imagine we wanted to print this table of data right here. We want to print this. And we have here 4 students within this table. The table, there are 5 columns. Each column has a column heading, last name, first name, department, GPA, and I feel there's a tab in here. Bear with me. Something is tabbed. Or so I feel. I could be wrong. Nope, it's my font. My font is out of alignment. Okay, that was weird. I paused the video because I noticed here that I want to tell you that the columns are all perfectly aligned, and I noticed that class standing is not perfectly aligned with senior underneath. And I know that this is a monospace typed font that I'm using. And so I'm just spacing everything back over, and it's still not aligning perfectly. And so what happened is I'm like wondering what's going on. Is there some funky character? And it turns out it's just when you zoom in, certain levels of the zoom, it spaces everything perfectly. Right here, everything's lined up. Now it's lined up, but now class standing is a little bit over, and it's still even more so over right now. But if I keep zooming in at one of these levels, like here, it fixes it. So I'm just going to make sure I stay at a zoom level where it's perfectly aligned, such as right here. Okay, so we have 5 columns of data, each with a column heading, right? And so imagine we wanted to print this, and notice how everything is left aligned perfectly. So this first name column, Bruce, Natasha, Thor, Tony, they're all, each of their names is starting right underneath where first started. So this is called, we're using formatted printing to make this happen, to do this nice alignment, to perhaps make these GPAs only have 2 digits after the decimal. All of that's done using formatted printing. So how do we do that? How do we take care of this alignment? Let's look at it. Let's start with making 2 sample students, and we save their data into respective variables for their names and for their majors and their GPA and their class standing. So Bruce Banner is going to be for student 1, department student 1, GPA student 1, class standing student 1, and then we have Black Widow, Natasha Romanoff saved as student 2. So we want to print this data using formatted printing. But first, let's do it without any formats, which we haven't shown anyway, and let's just show how we would use a simple print statement that you see here on line, I want to put an extra space here, on line 267. We have this long print statement. And let's make sense of that, because in order to use formatted printing, well, the first step is we have to realize, well, I want to print, here's this line of code, this line of output that we wanted to print, right? Here's the data, the table with the data in it. We want to print this first line. And we want it to be spaced nicely, but baby steps. First, let's print it, then let's space it. So if you want to print that first line, the first question you have to ask yourself is, how many things are being printed in that line? Well, here's the line. We have a last name, a first name, a major, a GPA, a class standing. That's 5 things that we need to print. So let's start by making this formatted printing statement with 5 placeholders. And we're not even going to put spacing between them, right? We want to print here the last name of student 1. That's going to be the first placeholder. Then we want to print the first name of student 1. That's the second placeholder. I'm not going to bother trying to guess, well, how many spaces came after Banner and before Bruce? Oh, it's that many. How many spaces between Bruce and computer science? It's that many. I'm not going to try to even do that. And you'll see why. So we're just going to print 5 of these placeholders back to back to back to back to back with no spacing between them at all. And we're going to reference the 5 variable names that we want to put the data from those variables into these placeholders. So last name, first name, department is this 3rd placeholder. The 4th placeholder here is referencing the GPA because that's the 4th thing we want to print. And then finally, the 5th placeholder is the class standing that we want to print right here. So when we run this code, look at how hideous it is, because everything is literally printed back to back to back to back to back, right? We have 5 things being printed. That's a disaster, but no problem, because now we're going to see the power of formatted printing, where what happens is we can put some stuff inside each of these placeholders. Let me repeat that. We can put some stuff inside each of these placeholders, and the things that we put inside these placeholders, we can tell Python, align it to the left, align it to the right, put over this many spaces, and we have a lot of control that we can have access to with the things that we're going to put inside these curly brackets. So let me come grab this last section here, or second to last section maybe. So once again, that's a disaster. Everything's printed back to back to back to back. So this here, we start by simply saying that it looks bad, because again, we haven't used formatting yet. So now we want to use formatting. Well, the first step of using formatting is we want to ask ourselves, this word banner, or better yet, this first column, how many spaces does this first column really make up? And we just count it. So I'm going to come all the way here to the left of the column. I'm going to hit shift and I'm going to just hit my arrows and I'm going to count and click the right arrow. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we see that this first column, it's actually 15 total spaces. Now, the word banner was left aligned on 6 of those 15 spaces. And then what follows was actually 9 spaces. 15 minus 6 is 9 spaces. Whereas Romanoff is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 total characters. So what will follow will be 7 spaces, because again, the column is a total of 15 characters in width. And that's also true for the first name column. It's 15 characters in width. Just trust me, I've counted it. The department column is 22 characters in width. The GPA column is 10 characters in width. And then finally, this last column, its width does not matter. I could specify a width, but it doesn't matter. And I want to make sure we're on the same page and we understand why it doesn't matter. So each of these columns, let's say the GPA column, how do we align that column? Well, the column is aligned, since we're left aligning it, it's based off of consistent width of each of these values that comes before it on the left of it. So here, each of the department column, each of these departments within the department column, they have to be exactly 22 characters wide, which therefore allows the GPA column to line up. Or this class standing column, how is it all perfectly lined up? Because the column that came before it, that column is all 10 spaces, right? But since there's no column coming after class standing, it doesn't matter the width of each of these. Sure, I could make a width, but it's unnecessary. So now we have the sizes of each of those columns, and look at what we can do. I want to put some space here so we can focus on this. Here's how we can redo that print statement above. We had this print statement right here. This is what we came up with. And look at how we've edited that print statement. So this is what we had. And look at what we've done. It's weird. We put this stuff inside. Well, what is the stuff? Let's do it in steps. The first thing is, if you want to use an alignment and you want to specify the number of spaces, you have to start by putting a colon. Then what's next is it's best to specify the type of data that's being printed. So what's being printed here within this first placeholder? It's a last name. That's a string, right? It's not an integer. It's not a real number, a float. It's a string. How do we specify a string? We put an S. So all of these, in fact, are strings, or the first 3 are strings. And even the last one is a string, which I did not put down here because you don't have to, but this is a string, so I'll put it. Now this fourth thing, the fourth column, that's a GPA, which is a floating point number, which we specify with colon F for floating point. So the S is for string, the F is for floating point. So now, what did we say? We said that this first column, it makes up 15 total spots, total characters, whether that be alphabetical characters or spaces. It's 15 total spots. So what I do is I simply put a 15 right there. And this was 15 spots. This was 22 spots. And we'll talk about the floating point. Well, actually, we already said it's 10 spots, right? And so we put the 10 there. And then finally, we have this left arrow. What does that do? Well, that's for left alignment. So I want all of these columns, the data within them, to be left aligned. So I put the left arrow here, 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 and here. And notice it has to go after the colon, but before the number. And that's what I've done. And so this looks pretty good thus far. The only thing we're missing is this 0.2. What did that 0.2 actually do? Well, it's what it really says is this entire column should print over 10 spaces, because we know the column is 10 characters wide, and we want because we're printing a float, which will have a decimal, that's going to be one of the 10 spaces, and we're saying to the Python interpreter, only put 2 digits after the decimal. Only put 2. And so when we run this code, let me get rid of this line so we don't print it twice. When we run this code, here is now the output. Where am I at? I am right here. This is what we did. Let me put a print statement once again before. Here's what we came up with. And let's put a print statement afterwards. Here's what we came up with, and this is the result. Well, if I had made this 0.3, check that out. 0.3f, look at what happens. It puts 3 digits after the decimal. What if I put 0.5f? It'll put 5 digits after the decimal. But I only have 10 total spaces, right? Because I said 10.5f. But since this is a GPA, we're going to put 10.2f, and we get exactly what we are expecting. So now that we've done that, let me erase this. And what I did is I did that for the first student. Oops, let me erase. Let me hit Control-Z several times. All right, so now I can erase this first one. So here's that first statement with Bruce Banner. Here's that second statement with Natasha Romanoff. And let me run that code. And so now that we've done this, what we can actually do is check this out. Finally, this column headings, this first row, which is representing the column headings, we may as well, instead of manually just hard coding this and printing up here, print this long thing. Well, since we already know the spacing of each of those columns, and I've already done this with formatted printing, I can use that exact statement that I've already made, and I can just make slight modifications to be able to print that first row. And here's those modifications that are needed. So we still have the 5 things that are being printed, but notice here I'm not putting variables. Instead, I'm directly putting the strings of text that I want to print, and I'm putting those strings of text inside quotation marks, separated by commas, as parameters to the format function. And now I have the same 5 placeholders. The only difference is this 4th placeholder is no longer printing a GPA, a floating point number. Instead, it's going to print the actual text GPA, which is a string. So with that in mind, now we get the total output. We have this first row, the column headings, and then we have these 2 students that are being printed. This is a lot. I really broke it down into detail, but it fully covers in a comprehensive fashion, I hope, formatted printing, how we can use the placeholders, how we can put things inside those placeholders to take care of formats. And really from here on out, we're going to want to be using formatted printing. The comma-based printing, it's a disaster, it's hideous. Concatenation is equally horrible when you're getting long print statements where you need to print a lot of values from variables. Formatted printing, absolutely the way to go. As always, reach out. It's been fun. Ask questions, comment if you need anything. Take care.